I recently read about a Lutheran pastor who asked his 6-year-old daughter what she learned in Sunday school. She was pretty animated when she told him, "I learned that Jesus was not a Lutheran." It can be surprising to us when we discover God is maybe not what we think God is. It's human nature, I think, to try to label God or to put God in a box. We study and pray and learn, but we almost can't help making God what we want God to be. Finding out that God is bigger or more generous or just different can be very challenging for us. It can make us frightened or confused or even angry when our understanding of God is challenged. But God so often comes to us in ways we don't expect, in the most unexpected places, in the most unlikely people. And that is, I think, a lot of what this gospel reading today is about. In last week's gospel, we read the beginning of this story. Jesus read them the promises of the prophet Isaiah. Good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind. And then he announced that those holy words had been fulfilled in their hearing. That's where the gospel picks up today. And this is the point at which the story shifts, the attitudes change, and not in a good way. Those in the synagogue had heard about the miracles and healings that Jesus did in Capernaum. And if he could heal people way over in Capernaum, they, his hometown people, were surely entitled to more. But Jesus shocks them back into reality. "Doctor, cure yourself," you'll say, and no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. It's about this point when you could probably hear people start to say, "Who does he think he is?" Jesus shocked them by pointing out what they were really saying and thinking. And some of the things they were saying seemed to be thick with the language of their own entitlement, because Jesus immediately called them on it. He reminded them of the times in their history where people who assumed they were entitled to receive more of God's love discovered that in God's eyes, we're all equally loved. He reminded them of the time Elijah chose to keep the Gentile widow in Sidon fed during a famine in which many of their own widows went hungry. Especially stinging to them, I think, was the reminder of when Elisha healed the military leader of their enemy. That, I think, was probably the tipping point. A friend of mine from seminary wrote, when Jesus read the words of the prophet Isaiah, not only did they believe they had Jesus figured out, they also thought they had God figured out. They believed they knew the scope and limits of God's love, so that Jesus' description of God's care for foreigners and enemies angered them to the point of them becoming willing to kill. Think about that. A description of God's care for foreigners and enemies angered people to the point they became willing to kill because of it. What a world they must have lived in. And who does Jesus think he is, anyway? David Ostendorf wrote that here, now, was the beginning of a new narrative out of the ancient narrative, out of and dramatically beyond the solid foundations of the people whose ears it fell. This is God at work, as God has been at work across the millennia, as God is at work even now, unfolding new narratives with, through, and among people who are often outsiders to the assumed faithful. He refers often to these outsiders, these others, people he calls edge people, whom God so often speaks through. I kind of get why they got so angry at Jesus. He wasn't confirming their image of what God was at all. In fact, he was challenging the interpretations of concepts they thought were long settled. We often have the same kind of reactions when long-held beliefs are challenged. But in this age of massive disruption, tectonic shifts in all our culture, especially in the church, God seems to be, once again, shaping a new narrative out of the ashes of the old ones. And this new narrative of God is almost certainly coming from people we would least expect. People at whom we would at first likely frown and shake our heads, and people who may well create frustration and even anger in us as we continue to believe in our own entitlements, as we continue to think God should love us just a little more and them just a little less. God, throughout history, has continued, sometimes quietly, sometimes very dramatically, creating this narrative that all of God's children are beloved and will be redeemed. This is God's narrative, not ours, of a world where there is good news for the poor. A narrative where in this world of abundance we have, little children don't go to bed hungry every night. Jesus reminded them that God's narrative is of a world where those in captivity are released, and in our world, not only those of us in captivity of physical imprisonment, but also the captivity of generations-old racism or long-held bigotry, of deeply ingrained prejudices. Not only the captivity, one that is plaguing our world right now, of people being forced from their homes to become refugees, but also our captivity of entitlement and greed and fear of the other. God will find a way, almost certainly in places we've never imagined. And the power of that way will change the course of the world. The great American author Annie Dillard wrote, "Why do people in church seem like cheerful, brainless tourists on a package tour of the absolute? Does anyone have the foggiest idea what sort of power we blithely invoke? Or, as I suspect, does no one believe a word of it? The churches are children playing on the floor with their chemistry sets, mixing up a batch of TNT to kill a Sunday morning. It is madness to wear ladies' straw hats and velvet hats to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews. For the sleeping God may wake someday and take offense, or the waking God may draw us to where we can never return." I always thought that quote of hers was a little bit harsh. How dare she refer to us as children playing on the floor and question if we have the foggiest idea, even if she, as she asks whether we believe any of it or not. Who does she think she is? Maybe, though, in light of this gospel reading from Luke, messages like hers are the ones we need to be hearing.